It is entitled The Proposed King's Lynn Incinerator and is held in the name of Mr. Henry Bellingham.
Mr. Hollowbone, whilst there's overwhelming consensus in favour of diverting waste from landfill, support for incineration is rapidly diminishing around the world. Increasingly seen as yesterday's technology and old technology that's going out of fashion. But in spite of this, Norfolk County Council have opted for incineration to sort out Norfolk's waste. And this is in the face of massive public opposition, which I'll come back to in a moment, in the face of opposition from the local borough council, the borough council of Kingston and West Norfolk, and also in the face of opposition from all of Norfolk's MPs. They awarded a contract to Corey Wheelbrater to build a huge 268,000-tonne plant at Saddlebow, near King's Lynn in my constituency, in March 2011. In spite of this opposition, an opposition, as I mentioned, from so many quarters, they actually tried to give themselves permission in June 2012 at a planning committee. But I'm very pleased to say that my right honourable friend, the Community Secretary, issued a holding notice and then called in the application, for which I am very grateful, and I know that Norfolk's MPs are equally grateful to him as well. Because the hearing before Norfolk County Council's Planning Committee was actually a total farce. No one received a fair hearing, but I'm confident that at the public inquiry we will be treated with great respect, and I have every confidence in the inspector. I want to say something about the site and the contractor, Mr. Hollowbone. The Saddlebow site, which is to the west of King's Lynn, is totally unsuitable for a county-wide facility. If you're going to put a county-wide facility in Norfolk, you don't put it in the far west of the county, not least because of a number of vehicle movements that are going to be needed along fairly stretched roads. Furthermore, it's upwind of one of Norfolk's largest communities, indeed Norfolk's third largest community. And I'll come back to the health risks in a moment. But it's also upwind of the international renowned Wash, famous for its shell fishery and indeed the breeding ground for many other species. It's upwind of numerous triple SIs and areas of outstanding natural beauty, including, for example, Roydon Common and the Dersingham Bog on the Sandringham Estate. It's also on a floodplain. And frankly, Mr. Hollowbone, the County Council couldn't have picked a more unsuitable site. I want to say something about the contract, because the figures are huge. The contract signed by Norfolk County Council with Corey Wheelbrater amounts to $596.9 million over 25 years. I understand the runners-up were Amy Sesper, whose bid total was £46 million more favourable than Corey Wheelbrater's. Norfolk County Council must explain why they went for the more expensive solution. We've got to see some transparency. And we've also got to see them actually making public their evaluation results. And furthermore, why did they switch to Corey Wheelbrater right at the last moment? They also negotiated a £20 million penalty clause and an agreement to pay Corey Wheelbrater's legal fees over a certain figure of £100,000. I find this quite staggering, and surely it represents an abject and total failure on the part of Norfolk County Council to protect Norfolk's hard-pressed council taxpayers. Ms. Hollowbone, my colleagues will be aware that DEFRA issued PFI waste credits about a year ago. We took the view at the time that those waste credits were not a good use of public money, and we also took the view that DEFRA's own criteria, which demanded a broad public consensus, wasn't actually met. However, the contract was signed, and PFI credits were also signed off. I want to say something else about the site, because Palm Paper, which is a large paper mill, are on this particular site in a nearby location. And at the time of the application, the planning application, Corey Wheelbrater claimed that they were in detailed and ongoing negotiations with Palm Paper for the offtake of heat, which was at an advanced stage of those negotiations. This was repeated, actually, in DEFRA's WIDP report, which was issued in October 2011. This is the Transactors monthly report. It's more of a sort of technical document, but it's one that was published the other day. And again, in this document, there's talk of links with Palm Paper for the offtake of heat. Well, Palm Paper have actually denied that talks were taking place. They denied that they were at an advanced stage. And so we do need to know what was going on about all of this. What was actually happening? Can the County Council and Corey Wheelbrater actually clarify things? Now, Mr. Holloway, what do the public think of all of this? Well, certainly during the consultation process, I chaired a number of public meetings, and both sides of the argument were put vehemently and strongly, and numerous votes took place at the end of those public meetings. A total of nearly 2,000 people voted, having attended those meetings, and 99% voted against the incinerator. The Borough Council then carried out a borough-wide referendum covering all of my constituency and most of the constituency of my honourable friend, the member for South West Norfolk. It was run by the Borough Council of Kingston West Norfolk under Electoral Commission rules, and the result was really quite remarkable. 65,516 people voted no, on a turnout of 92.68%, which on a turnout of 61.3% rather, so a total of 92.68% voted no. Compare that to the recent PCC elections, where the turnout was around about 12%, then this must be one of the most decisive, if not the most decisive, result in British electoral history. Now, neither the Norfolk County Council nor Corey Wheelbrater took part in the referendum. They could have done, but they refused to take part on so-called legal grounds. They could indeed have accepted the result, and they could have looked for some form of compromise, or at least discussions and talks, but they did none of that. And indeed, Corey Wheelbrater's advisors, a company called PPS, who are an independent communications consultancy, said in a document at the time, we need to suggest, I quote, we need to suggest that our absence from the referendum undermines the moral value of it, and that it carries no legal value in any event. I find that very cynical and shabby, Mr. Holloway. Of course I'll give way.
I'm very grateful to Bellingham for giving way. Could I congratulate him and commend him on the work he's done to stand up for his constituents, which of course is the cornerstone of our democracy. Would you agree with me that whatever the whys and wherefores of the issue, and I think there are some complex arguments here, localism often requires difficult and tough decisions from the locality, but that democracy is very ill-served when, at any level of government, we have a consultation and then ignore its findings, particularly when they are as overwhelming as this. Where difficult decisions require leadership, then we should do it without having a consultation, which we then ignore.
Well, I quite agree with my friend, and I'm very grateful to him for his excellent support. And I'd just like to add to that my honourable friend the Minister wrote to me the other day about the government's planning policy, and he said, our policy is to put power into the hands of local communities to shape the plans and the places where they live. Now, can I ask him, does he agree with me that it is quite wrong for any council, particularly a strategic tier, to ride completely roughshod over local people when local people have made their views so crystal clear? Now, I want to just say a word or two about incineration, Mr. Holloway. Is it efficient? Does it actually encourage recycling? And how green is it? Well, first of all, incineration has a very low energy efficiency. It produces more CO2 than oil and gas, and in fact even more than coal. On the plus side, it does generate electricity, but in doing so, the process of combustion actually creates new waste streams and new hazards. And I'll elaborate on this in a moment. But incineration actually now flies in the face of the whole philosophy championed in DEFRA's 2011 Waste Review, which talks of reduction, reuse, and recycling. Incineration actually crowds out the 3 R's. And Norfolk's current recycling rate is a pitiful 38%, one of the lowest in the country. Under Norfolk County Council figures, the recycling rate will move to 55.4% by 2020, still a very, very low rate. And I would suggest that incineration actually discourages recycling. The recycling revolution that's taking place is all about educating people, it's about encouraging young people, it's about encouraging the elder generation, people like my mother who never recycled anything in the past, who now is actually separating her waste and following the recycling rules. There is a recycling revolution going on, but I actually believe that with Norfolk County Council committed under the contract to supply 170,000 tonnes of waste to this incinerator, this beast will need feeding, and Norfolk County Council have got a choice of either keeping recycling rates very low or importing waste from around the whole region, or maybe both, which would be the worst of both worlds. So I would say that there's a disincentive to recycle built into incineration. And that is why, in the DEFRA waste hierarchy, incineration is falling down the list. And indeed, the whole world is turning away from incineration in the EU, in the US. Now, I'd just like to quote quickly from the Massachusetts state government 2010 to 2020 Waste Master Plan, in which they talk about a pathway to zero waste. The document calls for keeping the state's current moratorium on new incinerators, expanding reuse, recycling and composting, ensuring greater producer responsibility for materials, promoting recycling businesses and jobs. And they go on to say that on a per-tonne basis, recycling sustains 10 times the number of jobs than burning the waste. So that is a very, very strong argument, and it's going on around the world. Now, I want to ask a question, is incineration safe and healthy? Now, although the filters remove most of the larger particles, those under 10 microns are not filtered out. These are the nano or microparticles, and they escape into the atmosphere. They can be blown on the wind for up to 15 miles. Now, even if industry removed the particles, the nanoparticles, above down to 2.5 microns, some would still escape, and the ones that do escape, they contain CO2, obviously, nitrogen oxides, mercury, lead, and dioxins. And there's an additional problem, because a significant percentage of waste that comes out of the whole incineration process is actually left behind as toxic fly ash that has to be treated and dealt with. And there's a real issue here, because the site itself is in a flood zone. Now, many of these chemicals are both toxic and also bioaccumulative. And what this means is that they can indeed have an impact on people's health if people are subjected to them over a prolonged period. Now, of course, a lot of the studies going on are, at the moment, only just coming up with their conclusions and with their results, because this is an evolving situation. Very often, the lead-in time is very long, it's very slow. But there has recently been a report by the British Society of Ecological Medicine, and I'd just like to refer to this particular report. It was one that was written, it's headed The Health Effects of Waste Incinerators, second edition 2008, and the authors are Dr. Jeremy Thompson and Dr. Honor Anthony. And they particularly focus on those people, the very young, the very old, who might have a pre-existing respiratory condition. And what they say is that some of the dioxins, particularly dioxins called PAHs, can actually have an effect on people with these pre-existing conditions, and they estimate that the increase in the lung cancer risk goes up by 7.8 times, which I find really very, very worrying. These are PAHs, and they're called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Now, what does this actually mean? What it means is that if this incinerator is located upwind of King's Lynn, then there could be an impact on people's health. We don't know for sure, but I would just suggest that on the precautionary principle alone, you would not put it in this location. And furthermore, Mr. Hollowburn, substances like mercury and lead do not biodegrade. They remain in the ecosystems. They can have a long-term impact on food chains for a build-up, for example, through farming, horticulture, and indeed in shellfish as well. And so I would just suggest that we would be mad to locate this facility upwind of a population centre, upwind of very valuable agriculture and horticulture. And all I can say to the County Council is just have a look at the potential damage, look at the precautionary principle, and do not put a blight on our homes and on our habitats and on this constituency, on my constituency and on the constituency of my honourable friends who are nearby. I have a vision of West Norfolk attracting new waves of dynamic IT and life science businesses, but all of this could be put at risk by this particular project. Now, I want to say something about the company itself in the last few minutes, because the company, Corey Wheelbrater, is a partnership between Corey Environmental Limited, which is a well-known, well-established UK company, and Wheelbrater, who are a subsidiary of the US quoted company Waste Management, Inc., or WMX Technologies. The parent company in America has a truly awful record of performance. There is absolutely no doubt about that whatsoever. I've got a long list of examples of where they've either been heavily fined or severely reprimanded. Most recently, Wheelbrader Technologies, which operate 3 waste incinerators in Massachusetts, agreed to pay a staggering £7.5 million sum to settle a state lawsuit. Among the alleged violations included emitting ash through holes in the plant's roof and walls, failure to properly treat and dispose of ash, dumping wastewater into the surrounding wetlands. There was another payout, again in 2011, which was $77,500, which was in agreement with the Maryland Department of the Environment to resolve violations of the state's air pollution control laws in 2 separate incidents, both of which stem from a failure to control mercury emissions released from its South Baltimore incinerator. And indeed, if you go back a little bit further, there are other examples, and I've got a long list. I was going to quote 2 more, Mr. Holloway. But in 1991, the sheriff of Ventura County, California, issued a report describing 225 different criminal and civil actions over 13 years against WMI and subsidiaries. That, again, is a pretty staggering figure. There's a report in San Diego in 1992 that found, and I quote from the report, that the company's history requires extreme caution by the San Diego Board of Supervisors and other government entities contemplating any contractual or business relationship with waste management. It's clear that waste management engages in practices designed to gain undue influence over government officials. And indeed, I'd also just like to mention one other event from 1996 when WMX was found guilty of cheating, fraud, misrepresentation, greed, and other crimes in respect of hazardous waste. And indeed, the federal judge ordered an award of damages of $76 million plus punitive damages of $15 million. And he said a number of things, but he said, amongst other things, he said, what's troubling about this case is that fraud, misrepresentation, and dishonesty apparently became part of the operating culture of a defendant corporation. So I think this company has serious questions to answer. I would also ask Wheelbrader, Corey Environmental Limited, have they carried out full due diligence? And I'd also ask the Environment Agency, had they not looked at Wheelbrader's associated companies, its parent company's record in America? And surely this has some influence in whether or not they decide whether or not this company is a fit and proper company to be doing business in Norfolk. And furthermore, is this really a company that Norfolk's council taxpayers should be funding? Now, Mr. Holloway, if there were no alternatives to incineration, I'd be saying that maybe we would have to go along with incineration as one of perhaps the only solution that was available. But it's not the only solution that's available. I mentioned earlier the 3 Rs. I mentioned the recycling revolution that's taking place that all of us want to encourage. I mentioned the changing culture across families, across communities, regarding people who want to not just recycle, but also add value to waste. And there are a number of very exciting technologies that are now emerging. And one in particular involves anaerobic digestion plus plastics extrusion and manufacturing. There's a company called Material Works, which the Borough Council of Kings and West Norfolk have signed an MOU and a conditional contract with to treat all of their 30,000 tonnes of waste. And their process entails, first of all, methane extraction from anaerobic digestion, and then adding the fibres and digesters from the anaerobic digestion into an extrusion process, adding plastics and polymers, and ending up with a substance called omnisite, from which you can manufacture plastic products like fencing, like pallets, like roofing materials. Now, there's a conditional contract. We're about to open a pilot plant. But if this works, and there's a very strong chance it will work because of what's been proved on the continent, then Norfolk County Council's waste strategy would actually be in complete tatters because they'd be losing out one of the absolute key waste management partners in the waste partnership, because if they don't get the waste from West Norfolk, then I don't see how the strategy could indeed survive. Now, Mr. Holloway, my approach, and I want to make this very clear to the Minister, that I'm constructive and pragmatic. As I say, if there was an alternative to incineration, if there was no alternative to incineration, then I wouldn't be questioning this plant quite so vehemently. But I believe that there are cheaper, better, and more modern and more exciting alternatives that would command public support. Now, I've lived in Norfolk all my life, bar 4 years. All of that time in West Norfolk. West Norfolk has a truly remarkable environment. We have some world-class habitats. We have world-class biodiversity. We have an amazing tourism industry. We have some really, really impressive light industry and IT companies. We have a great deal going for us. We have a growing community. We have a great historic town in King's Lynn. We have some of the best farming in the country. We have a horticultural industry that's second to none. We have a shellfish industry in the Wash, but also is incredibly important. We have a number of those SSSIs, those areas of outstanding natural beauty. And we have a community that is very proud of itself as well. And what concerns me a very, very great deal is the fact that there could be a blight on this community. And the impact of that, I think, would be very significant. And I think it would be an absolute scandal if all of those things I've spoken of were put at risk. So what I'm saying to the Norfolk County Council is please think again. I know you've got this penalty clause. I know that you have made these commitments. I know that civil servants, officials and councillors, having made their mind up, don't like to change track. They see it as a sign of weakness. What I'm saying to them is why not sit down and talk to the local MPs, talk to all of Norfolk's MPs, talk to the Borough Council of Kingston and West Norfolk, and look for an alternative solution that could actually command public support. I think there's an opportunity to do this, and wouldn't it be far better than slugging this out in a public inquiry at huge public expense? Ms Holborn, there is a better way to go, and I'd urge that on Norfolk County Council and on Corey Wheelbrater.
The Minister has until 4:46 to respond. Nick Bowles.
Thank you very much, Mr Holborn. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'd like to congratulate my honourable friend on securing this debate of such vital importance to his constituents. I'm always in awe of my honourable friend, but particularly in awe of him when he arrives here at the head of an army of men and women from Norfolk who have turned out in an election in numbers that any of us elected to this place would envy in support of the cause that he argues for so eloquently. I do understand that, and I know that my honourable friend will understand, that this application, having been called in by the Secretary of State, which was something that my honourable friend was keen to see happen, it is now not possible, Mr Chairman, for me to talk about the details of the particular application for fear of prejudicing that process of inquiry and call-in. But if it would be helpful, then what I'd like to do just very briefly is set out the general national policy background for waste policy against which this decision will be made, and also to talk a little bit about how the process of public inquiry will work so that his constituents can understand how they can engage and have their opinions taken into account in that process. Firstly, on waste policy, and my honourable friend recognised the government's commitment and indeed saluted the government's commitment to a zero waste economy. And in preparing for this debate, I've come across a phrase which I thought was a really horrific phrase, the waste hierarchy. But when you dig behind the phrase, you discover a very, very intelligent and simple concept. And that is that the first priority should be to reduce our use of any material, that the second priority, if we can't reduce it, should be to reuse that material, that the third priority, if we can't reduce it or reuse it, should be to recycle it, and only then, if we can't do any of those things, should we think about energy recovery from burning it, and then, of course, only in the last resort should we consider disposing it. So he's absolutely right to point out that energy recovery comes way down that list, and to the extent that it is possible to push stuff in higher up that triangle into one of the other categories of reduction, reuse or recycling, the better. Now, what the government requires is for every area to have a plan for waste management. And I do recognise and congratulate Norfolk County Council on having such a plan, because that is the key basis for the decisions they make. Now, what we would prefer as a government that genuinely would like to see as many local decisions as possible, we would prefer local authorities to make decisions on waste as on other matters for themselves, having put in place the right policies through a plan on which they've consulted widely with local people. And so it is our default position that we would prefer a local authority in Norfolk to take this decision. But there are occasions when matters are so controversial or their impact is so widespread that the Secretary of State does have the right to call in such decisions. And the criteria, to be clear, suggest that where an application might conflict with a national policy on an important matter, have a long-term impact on economic growth, or could have significant effects beyond their immediate locality, or give rise to substantial controversy, that then there is a case for the Secretary of State to call this in to make the decision at a national level. And after my honourable friend and all of the other Norfolk MPs, plus I believe a total of 20 MPs, and many, many other people suggested that the Secretary of State should call it in, then that decision was the one that the Secretary of State took. So what we now start on, therefore, is the process of public inquiry by an inspector. And if I might briefly just set out how that will work, so that, of course, I'd be happy to give way.
The Minister for giving way, and I'm in debt to him for making these important points. Just on the point about Norfolk's waste strategy, would you not agree with me it would be much better if Norfolk County Council had actually got the full support of all of the districts, Norwich City Council included, and Kingston and West Norfolk Borough Council, to support incineration? Those other councils support the waste strategy in broad terms, but not specifically incineration. So there is a glaring default in their waste strategy.
Minister.
I certainly agree with my honourable friend that it would be preferable to have that support. I think we do need to recognise, and that this is not unique to incineration, that there are certain facilities that are required in every area of the country that are never going to be popular among their neighbours. And this may well be one of them. But what is absolutely the case is that there needs to be a thorough process of understanding, is this the right facility? Is it the right technology? Is it a necessary facility? Is it of the right scale? And, of course, critically, is it in the right place? Is the operator, as he is asked, a fit and proper operator? And all of those questions will be explored, should be explored by the County Council in putting together its plans, and will be explored to the extent that they are planning issues in the planning inquiry. So the timetable for the public inquiry procedure is designed to enable the application to proceed quickly and fairly. And I understand that the inquiry will commence on the 26th of February, and it is envisaged that it will run until the 19th of April. My honourable friend has made clear the extent and the strength of feeling locally in his constituency and beyond its borders about this application. He has set out some compelling arguments about the particular facility and the people running it, and the alternatives that he believes and his constituents believe could do the job that is required for Norfolk's waste without bringing the impact on communities that he so fears. That public inquiry will give him and the people he represents so capably every opportunity to develop those views, to put their arguments, and to have them tested out by a planning inspector. And that is what will inform a decision that the Secretary of State will ultimately make. I cannot promise him, of course, that that decision will be a decision that he will welcome. But what I can promise him is that the process of arriving at that decision will be thorough, will be open, and will give his constituents and him every opportunity to make their case.
Order.